Good evening, everyone, and thank you, Ken, for a wonderful introduction. My dad would appreciate it. I've been looking forward with great anticipation to my visit here to the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition. And my visit today in fact, it really exceeded my expectations. It's been a very exciting day, learning about how airplane cockpits are being redesigned, about how learning is being better understood, how robotics are being used to develop prostheses for human cognition. It's been a fantastic day. By the way, I apologize for the huskiness. I gave a talk in Chandigarh, India, which is in the foothills of the Himalayas, the first week in January, and came down with this terrible cold. It was freezing there. I must say it was a little bit warmer than here, but not a whole lot. And so I apologize for being a bit husky. Tonight I would like to talk about the emerging science of learning. And I'm especially pleased to discuss this topic because my visit today is to an institute that really is breaking significant new ground in the learning sciences. In many ways, the developing science of learning represents the broader trends of convergence in science and engineering. That's the intersection of research and education. And there's an explosion of interdisciplinary research that's underway right now. These are two of the remarkable trends, I think, in the area of education. I'd like to speak for a moment about the convergence of disciplines and then consider a bit what the science of learning is, what it could be, and why do we need it. And then I'll survey, very briefly, learning science across the scales, from the level of a cell all the way up to the classroom and beyond. Diverse streams of discovery merge at the science of learning frontier. And this is a wintertime image of the Aurora Australis. It's captured at the South Pole Station. It represents the National Science Foundation's willingness to go to the ends of the earth, literally, when it's necessary to invest in the frontiers of learning and discovery. Much of the excitement of discovery today in science and engineering ignites really at the interfaces of the disciplines. A legitimate question might be why we need a science, the focus of which is learning. And I'm reminded of an observation by a physicist, a friend of mine, Joe Reddish at the University of Maryland, who recounted a conversation he overheard between two of his students in the hallway. One was a senior, one was a freshman. The older student said, "You know, Reddish makes you think. That's what he really tries to make his goal." And the younger student said, "Well, that's fine if I have to think, as long as I still get an A." And as Reddish himself observed, education is harder than physics. Now, imagine if we taught baseball the way we teach science. Allison Gopnik, writing in the New York Review of Books, makes that analogy with humor, but also with a grain of truth. Young children, she says, would read about baseball techniques, answer quizzes about baseball rules, and occasionally hear stories about baseball greats. Well, some coaches would argue that students should drill in the fundamental baseball skills. Undergraduates might be allowed, says Gopnik, to reproduce a famous historic baseball play, but only in graduate school would they at last get to play the game. A century ago, school administrators organized classrooms along the model of mass production factories. The products, educated children, were produced through a top-down transfer of knowledge. Well, the world has changed, but many classrooms retain this antiquated structure. Hasn't really changed much from the 1890s. James Paul Gee, a University of Wisconsin professor reading, who watched his 4-year-old learn and enjoy long and very challenging video games. He believes that such games embody some very interesting principles of learning. And he was inspired to attempt a popular video game himself. When he was trying to do the game, he found it really difficult. How in heaven's name do they sell so many of these games when they're so long and they're so hard? He asked himself, noting that the subsequent games that the kids buy just get longer and more challenging. Well, he concluded, the theory of learning in good video games fits better with a modern high-tech global world that today's children and teenagers live in than do the theories and practices of learning that they see in school. Think about that. These are very provocative words. Even while they don't take notice of the changing approaches in science and math education, they do underscore the need to develop the emerging science of learning, to develop a scientific basis for an education system that's suited to the 21st century. Now, unknown to many university faculty in the natural sciences, especially at a very large research institution, is the body of recent research from educators and cognitive scientists on how people learn. And William Wood and James Gentili last month wrote in Science magazine an interesting notation. They observed that traditional lecture and laboratory courses are relatively ineffective strategies to impart concepts to undergraduates. And the research suggests, they said, that active, inquiry-based, and collaborative learning assisted by information technology trumps the older teaching methods. But the authors also note that many researchers don't read the journals that report these kinds of results. So the science of learning is a very broad canopy that arches over diverse scientific streams. And as observed in the National Academy of Sciences study, which is a very good study titled How People Learn, it says, what is new for a new science of learning is the convergence of evidence from a number of scientific fields, interdisciplinary science. The social sciences investigate the nature of perception and memory, and the role of motivation and emotion in learning. The biosciences cover the gamut from molecular to behavioral foundations of learning. The cognitive neuroscience brings us insight from the neural basis of learning in humans and related species. And the physical and information sciences and engineering are now creating machines that learn. The educational sciences cover pedagogy from schools to colleges to lifelong learning. So the convergences of insights from all these perspectives brings a much sharper resolution to our picture of intellectual development. And this kind of research builds the basis for the classroom of the future, even the foundation for learning beyond the classroom and for educating our future workforce, because children graduating in May 2004 can expect to change careers, not just jobs, careers 8 times before retirement. So we have to encourage the two-way flow of discovery between researchers and educators. And there was an insight that was gleaned from the Cognitive Neuroscience Laboratory that's a good example that may or may not work in a K-12 classroom of 30 kids from multi-ethnic backgrounds. The question really is of assessment. How do you test what students know? That's a critical area for progress. The National Science Foundation sociologist Steve Breckler, he heads up our Science of Learning Centers programs, observes that the science of testing assessment has frankly been dormant since not too long after World War II. Yet fields like statistics and psychology, with their very rich traditions of basic science of assessment, can help provide modern tools to assess learning. Now, here's another argument for a science of learning, showing that the components of learning operate at every scale from the genetic all the way up to the digital and to the societal. To really investigate learning, we have to integrate insights from every level through collaborations between biologists and engineers or between psychologists and computer scientists, much of what's happening here at this institute. While those in closely related fields under the learning science umbrella can collaborate now, the ones in the more distant fields may not really be talking to each other. For example, a scientist doing cell biology will not talk very often with or even use the same research jargon as a researcher who is studying how gender, race, or culture shape learning. The National Science Foundation is now setting up these centers for the science of learning. And one hallmark will be a given center's commitment to forging these linkages across the scales of learning science. Our first competition, which we just had this past month, brought in about 48 proposals, and the site visits are underway for about 12 of the proposed centers. The top ones will be selected in March, and the final evaluation will be by the National Science Board sometime later this year. Now, the National Science Foundation has already made what we call catalyst or planning grants to a number of institutions to explore the various models for learning science centers. And I'm going to give you just 3 examples that collectively suggest the breadth of learning science. My first example of a catalyst project focuses on human vision, perceptual learning, and brain plasticity. It's headed by Daniel Kirsten at the University of Minnesota and his co-principal investigators. Human vision is highly complex, with 10 million retinal measurements sent to the brain every second, where some billion cortical neurons do the processing. It's a magnificent computer, this brain. And as the team at Minnesota explains, a sea change has swept away the prevailing view of human vision as frozen in structure after a brief critical period. We're now beginning to regard vision as modifiable throughout the human lifespan. For example, the ability to process faces, such as identity recognition and emotions that are displayed by the face, matures in early adolescence. And in this image, we see a number of the visual areas that have been mapped with functional magnetic resonance imaging, the fMRI. The question is how the functional organization of these areas changes with diverse visual experience. Functional MRI also helped to pinpoint these visual cortical areas in the brain. Different areas are more active with different kinds of visual stimuli. For example, the V1 for edges, the LOC for whole objects. How does the brain's topographic organization and preference for different sensory stimuli change with experience? One example, V1 can change to respond to tactile stimuli. Imaging can be used to map these changes in perceptual function, and it really documents nicely the brain's plasticity. In any case, the center proposes, the Minnesota Center proposes to gather vision researchers, educators, and engineers to ultimately improve the quality of life for more than 3 million Americans who are visually impaired, not to mention 180 million similar people throughout the world. Another catalyst effort is attempting to unravel complex causal learning. This kind of learning is critical across science and engineering. There's a team that's led by Dr. Narayanan of Auburn University and his colleagues. They're focused on the workings of the complex systems that may seem opaque because of the abstract thought that's required that can change prevailing beliefs. This is an illustration. It's a concept map of an aquarium. It's drawn by a child. It's very simple. Now, here's the expert's map of the interactions in an aquarium. They're very complex. And among the unanswered questions about how to promote this kind of knowledge are, what is causal learning? How do scientists and engineers understand and model causal learning? And how can we foster this kind of learning from kindergarten all the way on up? Now, another catalyst grant, but this one takes a cultural approach. Carol Lee at Northwestern University co-heads an exploration of the diverse cultural pathways to learning by different human groups. And according to Lee and her colleagues, the core learning and development fields have not really in the main embraced cultural diversity. Yet by the year 2015, more than 40% of the school children in 15 of the United States states will come from racial and ethnic minorities. And what we need is an approach to learning that understands an individual within nested social concepts or contexts, from the family to the classroom to the neighborhood. And these kind of studies will help nourish the new field of cultural biology, which asks how the brain and the social environment interact. Now, from brain plasticity to these complex causal learning to cultural context is a very wide span, and I know that I'm introducing some very new concepts to you, but it's just a sampling of the science of learning. I'm going to turn now to a survey across disciplines and scales of learning research, from the cellular to the societal to the digital. And the overlaps between these disciplines make them more than the sum of their individual parts, producing knowledge that you couldn't get with the resources and outlook of just one discipline. As the National Science Foundation cognitive neuroscientist Greg Solomon points out, over the history of science, when the harder and the softer sciences have come together, the big questions have often been generated by the softer science. Let's begin this journey at the cellular level, where recent research has begun to identify some biochemical signaling pathways that are used in learning. And microarray technology, which is looking at the action of many genes at once, has opened the way to identifying gene expression that's related to learning. At the level of neuroscience, we know that in the past 20 years, scientists have learned more about the brain than they have in the previous 200. Past 20 years, they've learned more than the previous 200 years. As the author and neuroscientist Richard Restak puts it, he also notes that over 90% of all the scientists studying the brain who have ever lived are living today. Of course, some are in this institute. The application of brain imaging techniques like functional MRI to learning has just begun. And a very promising example is the work of Carnegie Mellon University's John Anderson and his colleagues. They've applied brain imaging to improve the assessment of a computer algebra tutor used in middle and high schools. Now here we see the algebra tutor interface. It's a very complex screen with multiple regions, and the critical aspects of mathematical learning have brain correlates that can be identified using functional MRI. The group used the functional MRI to identify 3 key brain regions that you can see here, which were discovered in middle school-aged students who were learning algebra. And combined with other techniques like eye tracking, the researchers believe that they've reached a new threshold of sort of mind reading. And importantly, they've begun to show how instruction can be improved by sensitivity to the individual student's uniqueness. Functional MRI has revealed new insights about dyslexia. That's a very common reading disability that afflicts many talented people. And so this powerful imaging technique, which arose from very obscure research on the energy state of an atom's nucleus, it didn't come from cognitive science, has now revealed that regions of the brain operate differently in dyslexics, as seen in these images by Genevieve Eden at Georgetown University. These insights have spawned new educational strategies to teach people with dyslexia to map symbols to corresponding sounds. And so intervention early in the dyslexic child's life is promising. Moving to another level in the science of learning, New theories take a broader look at what we term intelligence, thereby opening the door to consider the unique learning capabilities and the challenges of each student. Howard Gardner's theory proposes that 8 intelligences, linguistic, logical, musical, spatial, bodily kinesthetic, interpersonal, intrapersonal, and naturalistic. Well, schools mostly value only 2, linguistic and logical. Appreciation of the diversity of our mind's capabilities leads naturally to the idea that there are all kinds of minds. In the catchphrase of University of North Carolina researcher Mel Levine, he discards labels like attention deficit disorder and focuses instead on each student's own breakdown points in learning. I really resonate to this. Children learn differently. We don't all learn the same way. And we've given approbative terms to those who learn differently. Interventions can include improving such abilities as a child's time management. Just one example. One of the multiple intelligences, spatial learning, is very little understood. I'd like to focus on it just a little bit because it underlies much of science, from visualizing molecules to the structure of the earth, to a surgical procedure, all the way to a rocket engine. A lot of research has been done on how we learn to read, yet we don't know how people acquire or how to even teach these important spatial skills. David Holtzman at the State University of New York is studying the brains of snakes for clues to spatial learning. Adult snakes experience ongoing neurogenesis faster and throughout more of the brain than we mammals do. So activities affecting neurogenesis can be identified more quickly in snakes. This snake has been trained to find an escape hole by following either visual cues or the odor of a mouse. Both of these activities are examples of spatial learning. Now, the inset picture shows a snake's brain. It illustrates the cells produced after a spatial learning experience. A broader question is whether the environment, especially cognitive activities in the environment, can increase the number of neurons in a snake's brain, or even whether neurogenesis could be speeded up in the brains of mammals, including us humans. So this research begins to lay the groundwork to explore those kinds of questions. Now, how spatial skills develop in the child's brain is the focus of research by Nora Newcomb at Temple University. Her data seem to indicate a fundamental transformation of spatial thought between 18 and 24 to about 30 months of age. 18-month-olds, for example, can find an object in a sandbox, but they can't remember its location very well when they've been distracted. Insights about why a child finds, peekaboo game such fun actually have relevance to robotics, as in teaching a robot to investigate or navigate a new environment like a collapsed building or maybe a rough terrain on another planet like we're now watching on Mars. And so one of the great insights of learning science of learning, is the discovery that where people start from, the knowledge that they have, and the assumptions that they hold has a huge impact on how well they learn. Now, all learning involves transfer from previous experiences, and that's fundamentally, again, being studied right here at this institute. The idea that learning involves transfer from previous experiences. And that's stressed in a study by the National Academy of Sciences, a report on how people learn. Students' understanding of new material has to begin with the understanding of a point of view that they already have in their minds. And the children's book, I've shown it here, Fish is Fish, is whimsical. it depicts this truth. It tells the story of a fish who learns about life on dry land from a tadpole that's turned into a frog. Now, while the frog describes birds, the fish envisions fish with wings. When cows are described, the fish imagines fish with udders. Well, this perspective on the need to know where learners are coming from really applies to all ages. And so, moving up to the social level, it's been shown that stereotypes matter in learning. Poor expectations can lower test performance. For example, if women and blacks are subtly reminded of gender or racial differences in performance, they will score lower on tests. Catherine Dweck and Catherine Good, the Catherine team, it's Caroline Dweck and Catherine Good at Columbia University, they lead a team that studied calculus students over time. It's well known that students who view intelligence as a fixed trait are going to do less well when faced with difficulties, compared with students who see intellectual ability as the ability to develop. Put another way, boys are good in math, girls are not. An academic atmosphere that portrays intelligence as a fixed trait will reinforce the students' negative beliefs when they're already prone to believing race or gender stereotypes. Now, the project's results show that females who view math intelligence as a fixed trait, there's really not much I can do to change how well I learn calculus sort of thing, do not develop as strong a sense of belonging to their calculus class. And as you can see from the graph, students who perceive their intelligence as fixed have a lower sense of belonging in their calculus class. When a negative stereotype also comes into play, their sense of belonging becomes even more fragile. I'll move now to my final level of learning, touching on various ways that information technology and artificial intelligence are really just beginning to help us to explore and enhance human learning. The science of learning certainly feeds into the concept of human-centered computing, the idea that computer systems should dovetail with and expand human capabilities instead of forcing humans to adapt to machines. That's a principle, again, being studied right here at this institute. I'm showing you the virtual handshake. It's very interesting. It's everything except being able to touch and smell, which may be important to virtual learning in other tasks. Medical instructors say that surgeons need to be able to smell because part of perceiving when they have nicked a vessel, for example, depends on the olfactory nerves. Now, here's an example of the mind-machine connection right here that I saw this morning at the Institute of Human and Machine Cognition. Pilots, especially in combat aircraft, have to process very complex information. They have to make rapid-fire decisions. Yet, the traditional cockpit display on the left is very cumbersome. It's a very difficult way to convey information very quickly. And that type of format, it's just bristling with dials, was inherited from the steam engine because the Wright brothers and their contemporaries had no other models available. Now, the contrasting, much more intuitive display on the right, developed here, engages a pilot's central and peripheral vision in a comprehensive way. It enables the pilot to perceive where the plane is in a fraction of a second, instead of taking several seconds to look at all the dials and do computations in the head. With a new field called machine learning, it's almost like being able to explore learning in another dimension. Computers can process huge databases a whole lot better than we can. But they can give us insight into our own learning at the same time. So machine learning has been applied to counting insect populations like These are stoneflies that are shown here. And the goal of a project that's underway at Oregon State University and the University of Washington is to build a device that rapidly and automatically identifies the insects to family, genus, or species. Machines can recognize patterns in huge databases a whole lot better than we can. So very rapid, cheap counts of insect populations would be an important tool for the environmental sciences. Information technology also helps us tap into a very deep natural motivation for learning. And that motivation is to teach others. It's a motivation for all ages. John Bransford at the University of Washington and other scientists have developed the concept of what they call teachable agents. They're really virtual students. They're listed here by name, who the real students can teach. These are social agents who need explicit instruction to succeed. Now, if students teach if students teach agents like Betty, shown here, well, the agents can solve problems and pass quizzes. Betty does well or poorly depending on how she's been taught. The students have a chance to refine their teaching in the process, and they develop a better understanding of a subject than do those who prepare for a test. These environments are very motivating. Students are more willing to stick with teaching Betty until she gets it than to correct their own work. Well, here are some results. Students were assessed on how well they created concept maps of the nitrogen cycle. The groups in the middle and on the right learned by teaching. And the self-regulated group on the left didn't do as well as the students on the right. The self-regulated SRL did the very best. It's one of these things that we all know as we go through graduate school. If you're teaching a subject, you will know it a whole lot better, because in order to teach it, you really have to learn it. Another quick snapshot showing the value of learning by teaching. Students were assessed on their accuracy at reasoning tasks, specifically that is to induce, imply, or translate. In all of the cases, those who learned by teaching, the green bars, did the best. Now, another new approach using new media employs the web-based video. That gives greater depth, a kind of richer context to students' science investigations. You set up a problem, let's say to convey the concept of invasive species in an environment using video. In between the video segments, the students carry out the real experiments, or the related ones. I'll give a flavor of one such project that Bob Sherwood at Vanderbilt is doing, in which students are learning about invasive species in their own geographical areas. And ultimately, the hope is for the project to link classrooms communicating those investigations in different parts of the country. I want to show a very short video right now.
Mr. Wilson, can plants be seized at the border because they're possible hosts to unwanted insects?
We know there's a concern about the Mediterranean fruit fly, but it doesn't look like much.
Well, actually, Max, it is something. And ag inspectors definitely could have confiscated a plant from Cancun because of an insect concern. You see, the medfly was accidentally introduced in a piece of fruit that came in over our borders. And since then, California has spent over $100 million just trying to eradicate that little medfly.
Let me move out of the classroom now and into the realm of robotics. Daniela Rust at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology at MIT is working on self-organizing robots. Now, these consist of multiple autonomous components that make local decisions, and they create a kind of a coordinated behavior for the whole system. In the video that I'm going to show you, a distributed learning system is in action, and each module gets negative feedback if it disconnects or if it moves backward, and positive feedback otherwise. So let's show the video for that, please. Now, I'll show you another animation from Rusa's work, and this demonstrates the self-organizing robots moving along by conforming to the changing shape of the terrain in which they're located, whether going through a tunnel or up the side of a building. And they can also distribute themselves to form a kind of sensor network for monitoring. These robots could be very effective in hazardous or remote environments. Incidentally, this kind of work, again, is being done at this institute. And Ken, if you don't have open houses, I think you really should, because the public here in the Pensacola community should see some of the exciting stuff that's being done. I'm going to show another video. These are robots from the world of sports. Now, the robot dog teams that Manuela Veloso at Carnegie Mellon and her colleagues they actually compete internationally in the sport. It's kind of interesting. Now, it's not just fun and games, because Manuela points out that the Nobel economist, Herb Simon, ranked robot soccer right at the top of robotic achievement for the reason that it creates the ultimate environment for research on communication, movement, and learning. The dogs learn two ways. They learn offline, like athletes practicing skills, and they learn which function they should apply in a given condition. But they also learn while they're playing the game. It's quite fascinating. Veloso says, our robots learn by themselves which play works best. They adapt to their opponents, and they become smarter players by the end of the game. So let's watch a very short clip, and keep your eye on the red team. Watch the red team. Well, I'll conclude now by leaving the world of robotics and return to emphasize the synthetic character of new ideas about learning. And shown here are what NSF calls our GK-12 sites around the country. It's a program that implicitly acknowledges that the best learning is not one way. The GK-12, the graduate K-12 program, puts graduate students in classrooms, and the rivulets of learning flow in all directions. The graduate student, the classroom teacher, the K-12 students, and everywhere in between. And one of the Harvard fellows commented, the program helped make me realize that you can equipartition your energy into teaching and research and be effective at both. And in the meantime, making such connections amongst the various levels of learning underscore that early learning is as important as a higher degree. So the saying goes that a little learning is a dangerous thing. But if you put a lot of minds together, from cellular biologists to neuroscientists to cultural anthropologists and engineers and more, we've learned much more than a little. We've learned that learning reorganizes the brain. Different parts of the brain may be ready to learn at different times, that cultural and social settings influence learning, and a whole lot of other insights. These are just the beginning of what we may expect from this emerging science of learning. And I'm very pleased to have been able to share this with you tonight. Thank you.